Hi everybody, I'm Kelly from Let's Get Clacking, and today's video is going to be part one of a three-part video where I'm going to show you how to make different kinds of silicone molds. Now, part one will be a beginner, very entry-level type mold making video where I'll show you a few different ways that you can make molds out of items that you have lying around the house that you want to mold. I'll give you tips on the best kind of items that you want to use, how you want to go about it, just some basic things that you want to keep in mind when you want to create your own mold. Now, these kinds of molds can be used for resin primarily. I mean, that's the main part that I use them for. But depending on the kind of silicone you use, you might be able to even use these for things like food. You would obviously need to make sure that you have a food grade silicone that you are using, and that will ensure that when you're using it for food items like icing or baking or something like that, that it would actually be sufficient. Alright, let's get clacking! What you need for this tutorial is some nitrile gloves. I try and reuse mine as much as I can because they aren't damaged. You need some mixing sticks. It doesn't really matter what size mixing sticks. I prefer to use the slightly larger ones when I'm working with silicone because it's easier to get all the silicone out of the cup, out of the bottles. But if you have just the smaller ones, it's fine, doesn't matter. You need a measuring cup. It doesn't have to be a small one, it can be a large one, but the small ones, obviously if you're working with a small silicone project, the small ones are a better idea. You will then also need some acetate plastic. You don't have to use acetate plastic. I like keeping some of this because I use it for many different projects, but you can use an old plastic container, Coke bottle. For the method that I'm showing you, I prefer to use those types of materials because they're nice and easy to work with. You will also need some non-air dry clay. These are the best ones that I find at my local craft shop. Polymer clay is typically my favorite because it offers strength and the hardness that I need for my molds. I will show you why later on in the video. These clays are also nice to use. They are a bit soft, so they do get problematic sometimes, but they're perfectly okay and they're a lot cheaper. Or I mean, they're about half the price of this, so it's up to you which one you want to use. It doesn't really matter. But in this video, we're going to be using polymer clay. Then you will also need the item that you're going to mold. I'm just going to use a very simple lock cover. It's very flat, so it's a nice, easy thing to mold, but you really can use pretty much anything. You want to get something with a flat side for this particular tutorial because it's going to be the easiest item to mold, and you will see why later. You will also need your molding silicone. This is essentially the smooth-on silicone, part A and part B. It's a 1-to-1 ratio in volume. It's very important. A recommended item for this type of mold making is a clay machine, a pasta machine. Sorry, it's not technically a clay machine, but this is actually a pasta machine that I've just used for clay only. It's not required, but in order to get the best results, then this is recommended. If you don't have a pasta machine, then I would recommend going for the softer modeling clay, because the polymer clay can get quite difficult to work with if you don't have a pasta machine. If you do have a pasta machine, it's an absolute dream. You roll it through 2 or 3 times and you're ready to go. But if you don't, then you would need a rolling pin to roll it out relatively flat. Because obviously you want to get this as flat as you possibly can for the best results in your mold. And you want a little bit of clear Bostik all-purpose adhesive. The reason why I like using this is because it dries quite quickly, and you'll see why that's important near to the end of this video. An optional extra to use at the end of the video is this little tool. It is a cuticle trimmer, and you will see why at the end of the video. Another thing that's useful to have around pretty much for all craft projects is baby wipes. I use them to keep surfaces clean, to keep things clean, just to make cleanup a little bit easier at the end. because if you clean as you go, then you don't have too much cleanup to do at the end. If we were to make this mold out of the cookie cutter, then that was too small. We would probably have to have quite a big cookie cutter. No, that one's too big. That one kind of works. But you see how much wasted space there is on either side. And like I'm going to say many times, and like I said earlier, I don't like wastage, which is why I prefer going for the acetate plastic route, because it's something that you can reuse. You don't have to use it once and then it's done. So with this, it's a very small, narrow option. So what you can do is you can find a block or a rectangle that fits, something like that fits this shape. So I'm going to be putting these to the side, and I'm going to be showing you this method with acetate plastic. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is to roughly measure how much plastic we need to cut out to serve as a boundary for the mold. We'll probably need about 20 to 22 centimeters length of the acetate in order to go all the way around the mold. This piece of acetate is around 35 centimeters long. I don't need that much, but I will probably just cut a small strip of it just to make sure that we have enough. I'm going to take my craft knife. You don't need this to be very high, especially because this is a shallow item. You literally just need a few millimeters worth of clearance. So I'm probably going to cut it about 4 centimeters wide, just to make sure that we have enough clearance. Doesn't need to be exact line. We're not trying to win any competitions here. We are literally just creating a border so the silicone doesn't seep out. You probably can't see, but we have our piece of acetate ready. Now, essentially what we want to do is we want to have this going around like that and creating like a little bit of a dome. You can make it a teardrop. However, I just want to do this just so I can get the length. So I'm going to cut it off about there. So I need my sharp pointy thing again. Then what you want to do with this is you want to join up the pieces like that. So then we can make doubly sure that we have the right size. So we can make this, that should be about good. So we've got about that much clearance. So now what we want to do here is to take the Bostik and to put a line, just a very thin line of Bostik where we want them to meet up, and then just kind of zigzag the rest, and then put the cap back on because this stuff gets everywhere. What also helps if you bend the mold slightly, or the mold housing rather, because then it's not putting so much stress on the edges, and we do kind of want it to be shaped like that anyway. So it works for this. See, because now what it'll do is it'll now just dry like that. And then when you put it over the item, you can see how it's perfectly enclosing the item like that. Now you want to do this first so that while you're waiting for this to dry, you can move on to other things, because the polymer clay bit will take a few minutes. What's best when you have polymer clay like this is a little bit dry now. So when you are working with it, it is a little bit hard. It does take a little bit of convincing to get warm again and to soften up so that it's very workable. If you don't have very strong hands, then I would recommend using the modeling clay. It's a lot softer and a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to run this through the pasta machine a few times just to get it easier to work with.
A few moments later.
Now that you've rolled out your clay a few times, you have a nice flat surface. What's really advantageous about using the pasta machine is that you get a really nice finish on the top of your mold. So even though this is the beginner's version of this tutorial, this is a very easy way to get a very nice kind of semi-professionally looking mold. So you take the piece that you want to mold and you place it carefully down into the clay. You want to press it down a little bit. Try and press it down evenly. Don't press too much on the one side and then not enough on the other side, because what you'll do is you'll then end up making the item go lopsided, which means that your mold will come out lopsided. Okay, then I don't think we've actually given this enough time to dry yet, but the inside piece should be dry. So now we've created the housing. So we take the housing, we put the housing around the outside of the mold, of the item we want to mold. And we press it down into the clay. I find this easier to do with my whole hand. So you take your whole hand and you press it down, make sure that it presses evenly. Something that I do want to do before I press that down is to kind of measure the diameter roughly of the mold so that I can work out how much silicone to mix. So I'm going to try and pop it roughly back into circle format. So it's around 6 centimeters or so. So I'm going to use that as a guideline to how much silicone I need to mix. Okay, so I'm pressing down with my palm to try and create even pressure. All that you want to do here is you want to just get the edge into the clay. Might need a little bit of convincing, depending on the type of clay that you have and if it's been softened nicely. Okay. What's nice about this method is that even if you haven't completely pushed the plastic down into the clay properly, what will happen is it'll start creeping out on the outside. But because you've got polymer clay, all you do is you push the polymer clay up onto the edge and you kind of seal the hole, as it were. So we've now got our piece face up. That's very important, face up on the ground, because that's what you want to mold. So if you wanted to mold the flat side, then you would turn the piece over, because that's what would come up in the mold. But we don't want to mold the flat side, we want to mold the side with all the ridges, so we want to make sure that side is facing up. So then we're going to, I'm just going to quickly work out the calculations for this. I'll add the links in the description below for the 2 sites that I use to calculate how much volume I need for my molds. I like to roughly calculate these so I don't completely overestimate or completely underestimate the amount of silicone that I need. I don't mind underestimating because I can always mix more. Overestimating is not always the most fun because then you're just wasting silicone.
A few moments later.
I've done my calculations and the calculations say that I should have 28 milliliters of silicone. I know for a fact that that's far too much. I'm going to go with 20 against what the program is telling me, so let's see if that's a mistake. Like I said, I'd rather make too little than make too much. But because we're going to be working with silicone, I'm just going to put gloves on just to make sure that I don't harm myself or anything like that. It's probably not required, but it's generally best practice to put gloves on when you're working with these kinds of materials. With this kind of silicone, you definitely need to make sure that you stir it enough, because sometimes some of the stuff sifts to the bottom and it gets stuck. So you want to make sure that you have stirred it up so that you don't have parts of it lying at the bottom, which means that, you know, the silicone won't cure, etc., etc. You definitely don't want that. And with the silicone, it's nice and soft, and then at the bottom you can feel it's like a slightly hard layer that you've got to like dig into and like sift around. You don't want to do this too vigorously, because what you'll do is you'll then just introduce so many bubbles into the silicone, and you definitely don't want to have millions of little bubbles. So I like to almost go in the box to go up, down, up, down, up, down from the one side to the other side, and then top from the one side to the other side as well, just to make sure that I've gotten everything off the bottom. Scrape it off the side. You can see there's like clumps. There's clumps here. You want to kind of stir it around a little bit properly as well. Okay. I like to try and hold my cup up to eye level so that I can see exactly on the measurements where the silicone is ending. And what I like to do is exactly this. So I pour it on the side of the cup so that I can scrape it off. So that I can kind of control in little bits how much silicone is actually going into the cup. It does mean you have to wait a little bit longer for the silicone to run into the bottom, but it's not the end of the world. Now, theoretically, according to Smooth On, what you should be doing is to pour them into 2 separate cups and then pour them together into a 3rd cup. But I'm mixing 20 mils of silicone, like it's really not going to make a difference. If I was mixing a few hundred, then yes, I would do that probably. But with this small amount, as I'm very thorough, and I will show you when I start mixing, I'm very thorough with my silicone, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to be okay with, you know, putting them into the same cup. I've done it for many molds that I've made, so I'm happy with this method. But you have to be thorough. You cannot pour the silicone in and then just stir it once or twice and then hope for the best. You have to be very thorough when you mix. So I'm just waiting for it to get to the 10 mil mark. Just going to push some of that down there. This is a 2-part silicone. So the reason why I like it is it's a 1-to-1 ratio. A lot of other silicones are, you know, different ratios. It makes them less foolproof. So you don't have to worry about, you know, oh, did I get the calculations correct? Is my maths right, etc., etc. It's 1-to-1. If you put 10 mils in of the one, you've got to put 10 mils in the other. It's cut and dry. You can see that there's almost exactly 10 mils, so I'm happy with that. Get the blue one. If you're going to be mixing them in the same cup, you need to make sure that you're going a little bit slower. This is the blue one, so it's a nice, beautiful, deep blue color. Obviously it's mixing with the white, so it'll get a little bit lighter, but you don't have to mix it as thoroughly. The white one is the one that's generally the problematic child. Now we've got that mixed. I'll do the same thing as what I did with the white on the side, but instead of doing it here, I'll just move over a little bit so that I don't cross-contaminate between the 2 colors, between the 2 silicone parts. Now obviously you just need to make sure that it gets up to 20, which we are almost there. As everything starts dripping in from the side, the level starts rising. So you need to make sure that you don't over-invest, essentially, and pour too much in the beginning and then wait for the stuff to drip off the side if you're going for this method. Scraping off the sides a little bit just to get, and that's almost exactly 20 mils. Close this back up. And now for the fun part. So now is the part where we get to mix everything together. When it comes to mixing, you need to make sure that you scrape the sides, that you scrape the bottom, that you scrape the bottom sides, you scrape the corner, you go clockwise, counterclockwise, upwards, downwards, every direction that you can possibly think of, you need to go in for the silicone, because if your silicone does not mix properly, it will not set. So I like to start out with going around the sides just to scrape that stuff off. And go down there. Just so we just get that stuff off first, because that's going to be a problem if you have to pour it out. Okay, great. Now is where I try and mix it around, and then I go up, down. So you kind of scrape in on the sides and bring it up, and it actually looks really pretty while it's busy mixing. Like there, it kind of looks like an acrylic pour, which I really like. I always wondered what will happen if you kind of just leave it in this box, in the cup like this. I know that it won't actually properly set, but it would be so nice if it could. And And the nice thing about using these clear cups is that you can see how well it's mixing. If you use a cup that's not clear, you won't really be able to see all that well. So you definitely want to get an insight, because I mean, look at that. It's not mixing at all. So you need to make sure that you are scraping the edges, like aggressively scrape the edges. I mean, you're not going to break the cup unless it's a very old, not so nice cup. I was about to use another word. And obviously you don't want to be too aggressive in your stirring, because otherwise you're just going to get tons of bubbles in there. And you don't want tons of bubbles in your mold. According to the specs, you should be stirring it for at least 3 minutes, which makes sense. So that's roughly the same time as that I stir it for. But in all honesty, as long as you can see that there's no lines in the color and that the color has completely mixed, you're okay. So I mean, we're probably fine with the color the way that it is now, but I always like to do one last check around the container before I make any assumptions. So here is where it hasn't mixed, but that's mostly on the outside. So that's okay. I'm just going to put that there. I will mix it in. And then you check on the sides. At the bottom, if you can turn the cup upside down, do it. If you can't, just hold it up and see if you've gotten all the scrapes on the edges there. The corners will generally be the worst part of the cup. But this is pretty much, I'm happy with the consistency of this. I'm pretty sure that it has mixed properly. So I'm going to go ahead and pour. If you had a vacuum degassing chamber, you could then put this into a degasser. Essentially what that does is that pulls all of the air bubbles out of it. A, it's such a tiny amount of silicone, and B, I don't actually have a vacuum degasser. So we're just gonna have to try and, you know, hope for the best. When it comes to silicone, is they cure best at room temperature, which is 23 degrees according to this product. So if you have a colder room temperature, like if it's maybe the winter months or something like that, or if you have an aircon running in the room and it's running at 17 degrees or, you know, whatever, then your silicone will take longer to set. If you have it running higher, your silicone will set faster. It's just something to keep in mind depending on the climate. As you can see, there's lots of little bubbles popping up as I'm holding it here in my hand. Just trying to warm it up a little bit just so that you may have a little bit less of a problem. But in all honesty, it's not really terribly necessary. When you're pouring, you want to pour from a high height. You want to have a thin stream of silicone. Now, why is that important? Because of bubbles. If I had to upturn this cup and just dump it on there, then they would probably get bubbles everywhere and your mold would not look all that nice. You want to make sure that your mold has the highest quality that you can, and by holding up the cup from a high height and letting it have a very thin stream, those bubbles pop before they get into the mold. It allows time for the silicone to roll into the mold carefully, slowly, at its own pace, essentially. And it'll get all the crevices and it'll get all those tiny little details of a mold that you really enjoy. So let's see. Now what you should be doing is pouring the mold from the lowest point and allowing it to fill in everywhere. But with this kind of a mold, I think it's okay because it's so thin. So we should be alright. The actual mold itself. If it was a higher object, like the actual thing that we were casting was a bit thicker, then that might be a problem, but not for this one. So you see how thin the stream is? You probably don't need to go that thin, but we don't have very much silicone. So I want to make sure that I'm pouring it nicely. I mean, obviously if you've got a much bigger mold, to pour it at this pace would probably take you forever. So you might want to pour from higher up or at a slightly faster pace. And I realize that now I'm probably holding the cup on the wrong side, which means you can't actually watch it pour in. Yes, now I try and scrape everything out of the cup. I always try and get as much as I can into the mold. I've mixed the silicone, so I might as well use it. And it's just going to dry in the cup anyway. So if I don't get it in the mold, what's the point? It's also why it's so important for the walls of your cup to be mixed and not have remnants. So now what you can do is you can literally just leave that in there like that. I normally do, because the silicone will dry and it will peel right off the cup and the stick. I don't really like doing it on the stick because silicone doesn't stick to the sticks. Haha. But it is a bit of a nightmare to get off if you want to use the sticks for something else. So normally when it comes to the sticks, I just clean them with the wet wipe. There we go. Reusable stick. And the mold is now set. I mean, it's not leaking out on any of the sides, which is great. It's the perfect thickness. It's a very thin mold, so we really don't need a lot of coverage here. Like I said, if it was thicker, I would have obviously erred on the side of slightly higher, but it's not, so we don't have to worry about that. We will then be back once this mold is cured, and we can then unmold it and show you what the product looks like.
One eternity later.
Time to unmold. So it's been a little bit longer than 6 hours. It's pretty much been 2 days. Life gets in the way sometimes, so I obviously don't have my gloves on anymore because it's all cured, so we don't have to worry about that. So this is obviously stuck down a little bit to the table from when we pressed down on it, but that's fine. So you can just pull it off. And something that I also forgot to mention when we were pouring this is the reason why you would want to go for polymer clay as opposed to the gluing down on a piece of plastic method is something that I'll show you in a second. And it's something that I actually want to do in a comparison video to show you the difference between 2 different types of molds, mold making methods more accurately. So you just want to kind of gently nudge it out. You probably can push it out. Oh, I like to be gentle, and what's the point in being brutal and brute forcing everything? There we go. Simple pop out, and then this you can just peel off. And there, your mold is perfectly formed. You can see that it's a little bouncy because the edge of the top of the mold, or the meniscus of the silicone rather, it shapes up. So what I like to do, obviously you don't really want to pour it like this because it can give you problems. So I have a cuticle trimmer, and the cuticle trimmer just helps me to trim that edge off so that it doesn't bounce. And you can just chuck those away. And then when you lay the mold flat, it actually lays flat, it doesn't like bounce up anymore. So you'll see here, it didn't cure 100% properly, but that's because when we poured this, the glue was actually still wet. So it doesn't cure against the wet glue, which obviously just shows you how sensitive the silicone can be. So don't be like me and don't rush it. Let it dry for a little bit first before you pour the silicone. But it doesn't matter because it's on the side anyway. So the actual mold that we've made is perfect, and you can see the edges are beautifully clean. So if we had done this with sticking this down onto, you know, just a normal piece of plastic, then the silicone would have all gone underneath the item, and you would have been left with ugly bits where you have to cut off, and your edges wouldn't be really nice, which would affect the way that you pour the mold. Because in all honesty, when you have a mold that you've cut the edges off and you've been fiddling around with the edges, it creates these little nicks in the mold. I'm sure you guys have seen it when you've cast things. There's a difference between a beautifully flat mold and one that has little edges. I've got a Monstera or a Delicious Monster plant mold that I've poured before, and I'll get it out so I can show you the difference. Here's the Delicious Monstera leaf, and you can see on the edge how it's a little bit rough and it like creeps in a little bit. Let me make sure that you guys can actually see this. So you see there, so now what happened here was this was something that I'd made from a polymer clay cast, and you can see the edges aren't very nice. So if you had to cast this, it wouldn't look very pretty. And obviously then if you're casting from a normal mold, you see how the edges are nice and smooth. Obviously this is on the back, on the top side. So the top side is where you would see that difference. I sealed this top side, that's why it looks a little bit better, but you can see the difference between the edges. There it's all smooth and there it's all rough and bumpy. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer this method, and I almost don't even want to show you the other method. You can see how the polymer clay is all cracked, but what you can do is you just give it a bit of a wipe down. It's just some alcohol wipes, just clean it off a little bit. I mean alcohol spray, sorry, rubbing alcohol. Seems like that little plastic thing is, the sticker has transferred onto that, which is fine. Get that off, and then you can just reuse this. I mean, it's obviously polymer clay, so you can just work it again and use it for your next mold. So, you know, I'm all about reusing, reduce, reuse, recycle. This is the perfect example of that, because it's something that you're not baking the clay, so you're not essentially wasting it at all. You're just reusing it for more molds, so you can create molds from many different types of things, which is obviously why I like this method. Just want to give that a little bit of a wipe down as well. Just so that it's not sticky. And then obviously you can see there's a little bit of a lip on the top, so then if you want to, you can just trim the edge off the top of the mold. And there, I mean, it's a very, very simple mold, and we've just got one product, but obviously that's, you can take the same principles and you can apply it to one item, 2 items, 3 items, 4 items. I mean, you could line, if you wanted to make this a square instead of this shape, you could have exactly the same principles and you can line up many things right next to each other. The options really are endless when it comes to making molds like this, but this is the basic principles that you can now take and apply to whatever other kind of things you want, and make your own molds. If you have something at home that is precious to you, that's a keepsake, that you want to, you know, remold and remake into a different color or something like that, you know, you can do exactly this. You can take the item and just remake it. If you have made it this far, congratulations, and thank you for sticking with me. That was a lot longer than I had intended for it to be. But thank you so much for watching the entire video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel as well. Click the little notification bell if you'd like to get notified of any new posts that I make. The next one in the series will be an intermediate video of how to make silicone molds. So I'm going to be using polymer clay and sculpting my own mold, or sculpting my own thing to mold. It's going to be a little bit different to the one that I made today, so it won't, instead of being a simple flat object, it's going to be a higher object that requires a little bit more calibration and a little bit more work to get it correct. So thanks very much again, I really appreciate it. If you have any suggestions, or if you'd like to find out anything else that I could maybe cover in a future video that you would like me to cover, please let me know in the comment section below. You can subscribe over here, and on this side you'll be able to see my latest video. If it's not this one, if you're watching this, you know, far in the future, or if this video is in the past, time trouble, then you'll be able to see my latest video over there. And here's a video that YouTube will think is cool and is relevant for you. So take a look at that one too. Thanks very much, guys. Have a wonderful day, and be kind to somebody today, if you wouldn't mind. I think the world needs a little bit more kindness at the moment. Cheers, guys.